Well, good morning. Another wonderful Saturday and another special day. It's always special when we get to spend some time with fascinating and interesting people. And I just enjoyed the day when I get to spend it with all of you. But we're going to meet someone very fascinating today, another author by the name of Kate McGovern, and you're going to meet her in just a few minutes. So put on the brakes, grab a cup of coffee, and join the conversation because it's time for Coffee Breaks with Steve. We're going to get on to our topic, and I was moving pretty quickly, I hope, through our special days because this one is going to take a little bit of our time. It won't run us over time. But this was another one of the conversations that we recorded in advance. I had an opportunity earlier this week to speak to our special guest. And I want to tell you a little bit about her. And I'm just going to tell you up front, and you'll see it as we go through the conversation, that although it was recorded in advance, oh boy, here we go. Hang on. Thank you. Even though the conversation was recorded in advance, I invite and encourage you to put your comments and even ask your questions of our guest in the chat. She'll be able to come in later on and see those and respond to them. We still want you to be part of the conversation today, but let me tell you a little bit about our guest. Kate McGovern is the acclaimed author of 3 novels for young adults and middle grade readers, Fear of Missing Out and Welcome Back, Mabel Maida Cohen, both Junior Library Guild Gold selections, and Rules for 50-50 Chances. Her most recent novel, Welcome Back, Mabel Maida Cohen, evolved out of her experiences working with middle schoolers in classrooms and after-school programs. Kate was inspired by many of her former students, young people who, like Maple, are bright, curious, engaged kids with many gifts, but who sometimes struggle with reading. Kate has also written plays and essays and has a Bachelor of Arts from Yale and a master's degree in social anthropology from Oxford. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with her husband Nahit and their daughters Priya and Kavya. So I will just invite you now to join me, even though pre-recorded, please, in welcoming Kate McGovern to Coffee Breaks with Steve. And please do participate and be part of the conversation. Well, Kate McGovern, welcome to Coffee Breaks with Steve. Thank you for being here. It's good to have you joining us for the conversation. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm great. Thank you.
Well, listen, we talked a little bit in the introduction about your background and things, but I just think it's interesting. Anytime I talk to an author, talk about a little bit about how and when your interest in writing really began. What was it in life that caused you to think you should be writing books?
Sure. Well, so I mean, I always loved writing. My parents will tell you they still have a stack of my sort of first and second grade early novels in their basement. But yeah, I always sort of thought of myself as a writer and gravitated toward writing and creative writing in school. But then when I graduated from undergraduate, I moved to New York to work in theater. I had always done theater. I was an actor and performer, and I was also writing plays. So I was kind of bringing in some of the writing interest to my theatrical pursuits. And then while I was kind of on the audition scene and writing short plays in New York, I took a job working in a middle school in Harlem as part of the Harlem Children's Zone organization and supporting students with reading. And through that, I kind of shifted away from working in theater because I realized that I was really passionate about working in the education space. And over time, I started to feel like writing for children was a way that I could kind of combine these interests. So bringing together my passion for writing with some of the work that I was doing in schools with kids. So that was how I sort of came to the interest in writing novels for children and started just toying around with that, and started writing for teenagers, young adults, in probably, oh gosh, I don't know, 2010, 2011, something like that. And wrote a bunch of drafts of things that didn't go anywhere. And then finally wrote my first complete novel, that I sold in, I think, 2013.
Wow. So I'm always also a little bit curious for people who follow certain careers. What was your undergraduate degree in, and do you have any other degrees beyond that?
My undergraduate degree was in American Studies,
Okay.
and I also studied a lot of theater, as an undergrad. And I have a master's degree in social anthropology, which sounds like it's probably not that closely related to anything that I'm doing with my career. But I have always really been interested in, um, like the exploration of people and communities, and places where I'm a little bit of an outsider. So that's been sort of a common thread of, just a real interest in looking in and learning about, people and communities that are different from me. And that's been a sort of common theme from, I would say, from my undergraduate studies through graduate school, and
Yeah.
even to now.
And what specifically may not be the right word, but what were the things that occurred in your life and in your training and in your, whatever else, the theater world, the spending time in schools in Harlem? What were the various elements that led you to go, okay, young adult and middle grade novels, that's going to be my niche, that's the area I want to go? And I'm not presuming in that you haven't written other things, but I'm just curious about that specific direction, because you have now, what, 3 published
Mhm.
novels that kind of cover those age ranges.
That's right. Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about those titles and the books and the plot lines themselves, but what influenced you to think about writing and focusing on those age groups?
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, I took this initial job working at this middle school in Harlem with sixth through eighth graders. And at the same time, I sort of branched out and I started teaching theater workshops and doing reading tutoring, for kids in a range of schools around New York. So, some in Manhattan, some in Queens, but all in that age range. So sort of like 12 to 15-year olds or so, maybe 11 to 13, something like that, right in that age range. And then I after that period, I moved to the UK and I worked in a school there as well, slightly younger kids, so like, 10 and 11-year olds. So all of my time working in classrooms had been with that age range of kids, from sort of like 12 to 15, um, and I really feel like that's kind of a sweet spot for young people. Like there's so much growing and exploration, and just amazing stuff that happens in that age range. I'm a parent now and I have 2 kids who are younger, and I will say I really have no interest in writing for small children. Like, I totally respect the work that picture book authors do. I
Mhm.
think it's just like an incredible art form, but for me, what compelled me to write for kids was really the sort of exploration of all the stuff that's happening when kids are in that sort of pre-adolescent and adolescent phase: friendships and romance and figuring out who they are, and, just kind of becoming the people that they want to be, and all the struggles that come along with it. So that really was inspiring to me and made me feel interested in writing for that age range. That, and I think, the last decade or so in publishing has seen just this like incredible explosion of wonderful work for that age group. So, I mean, I saved a lot of the classics that I read as a kid, thinking that my own kids would read them, and I'm sure that they will read some of them.
Yeah.
But there is just so much wonderful stuff out there for kids that's come out in the last,
Oh, yeah.
several years, and it just continues to grow. And so I was really inspired, and just excited to kind of try my hand at being part of that.
Yeah, there really has been. You talk about the classics, and I think all of us can think about the books and the book series that we grew up with that were aimed toward a young adult, or as you said, that sort of adolescent, pre-adolescent just started the teenage, but there really has been a renaissance in that in the last couple of decades. And we can think of authors and books and series. And I think it really is, there's a lot to be said, and probably you can pat yourself on the back for being able to enter that. Talk a little bit maybe about, you mentioned friendship and romance. There are a lot of things, both positive and challenging, that children within that realm are dealing with. What are some of the focuses of your books? And maybe talk even a little bit about the individual titles and plot lines.
Sure. So my first two books are for older kids. They're for teenagers. And they both fall into this, what I would call this sort of subgenre of like sad realistic fiction for teens, which is a kind of evergreen little subgenre of work. Like when I was a kid, I loved reading like sad girl teen books, for lack of a better way to describe them. And so that's where I started when I started writing for teens. So my first book is called Rules for 50-50 Chances, and it's about a teenager whose mother has Huntington's disease. And as she approaches her 18th birthday, she's trying to decide if she wants to take the genetic test that will tell her if she carries the gene mutation for Huntington's as well. So she's grappling with this huge question of whether she wants to know if she's going to get this disease or not. And with that, all of the questions about, what is she going to do for college? What does her future hold? And that book was inspired by, I've always been interested in writing. I also have sort of think of myself as like, maybe in another lifetime, I would have become a doctor or focused on genetic medicine. I'm super interested in the medical world. And so I was really drawn to doing a lot of research on this particular topic. I read an article about a young woman who was in a similar situation. And I just thought this is an incredibly challenging kind of circumstance to be faced with as a young person. And this is a huge question. And that story and the question of what would I do in that situation, like really stuck with me for years before I sat down and finally wrote the book about it. So there was that one. That was my first book. And then my second book is called Fear of Missing Out. And it's for the same age range, sort of, 12, 13 and up. And that one is about a young woman who has brain cancer and understands that her treatment options are limited. And she learns about the possibility of cryopreserving her brain after her death. And so she goes on this kind of road trip and life journey to decide if this is something that she wants to do, very much against her mother's wishes, but with the support of her best friend and her boyfriend. And so again, kind of teen dealing with really heavy circumstances. There's a science and a medicine component, and this sort of fundamental question of who do I want to be and what do I want to do with this time that I have left. So that was not a cheery book, so I wrote these two like kind of sad books. And I think I told you when we spoke before, in the middle of the second book, the process of the second book, right after I finished the first draft and before I started working on revisions with my editor, is when my first daughter was born. So in the middle of this process, I became a mom, and that really kind of changed shifted my appetite for writing about like dying children and really some of this heavy stuff. I just didn't have as much capacity to kind of explore in depth those circumstances. It just became too kind of painful to even explore in writing. And so my third book, which is my most recent book, which is Welcome Back, Maple Mecca Cohen, which is for younger readers. So this is like 8 to 12 is really the spot for this book. And this one is about a a fifth grader who gets held back in school because she has had an undiagnosed reading disability. And when her struggles with reading come to light, her teachers decide to hold her back in school. And she ends up telling a lie about why she's been held back. And of course, that lie gets her into all kinds of hot water with her friends. So while it isn't it does deal with some complex and challenging topics. It's a much lighter read than my first two books.
Yeah, I mean, you are including some things that can be a bit heavy, and I think sometimes the immediate reaction is, well, that doesn't sound fun. But the reality is that there's a relatability, right? I mean, I think for young people, and I would suspect that, that over the course of the novel, we're not simply dealing with death and sadness. I mean, there's an element of that, but there has to be certainly a compelling reason. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to share your pitch deck. I'm going to ask you the question. So why, as a parent, would I want to take one of your novels and give it to my teenager or to my preteen to read? What is the compelling element about your writing?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I think children are they're asking these questions and they're interested in these topics. And sometimes as a parent, I think I don't have kids this age yet, but I imagine, and I already know from my own 6-year-old bringing up challenging topics, that it can be hard as a parent to sort of know how to answer some of these big life or death questions. And so and my books, I think, are included in this. Books can be a way into some of those conversations for kids. I think that, the first two books in particular for teens have just a lot of space for kids to kind of read and also ask themselves, like, what would I do in this situation? Or, how is this question that I don't have to deal with in my own life, but how is it related to something that I am dealing with in my life? And so a lot of the stuff that is very specific to the sort of medical conditions that these kids are dealing with is still related to, some of the sort of more universal questions that teens are always coping with, right?
Yeah.
Who do I want to be? Who am I? Who are my friends? How do I connect? All of those kind of things. What do I want to do with my future? And so I think the books have a lot of space for kids to explore some of those questions. And like you said, they also have, there's a lot of humor along the way. There's a lot of stuff about friendship and what makes you kind of a good friend, and what does it take to be a good friend to someone who's going through something hard. Stuff like that is absolutely present in these books, and in, I think, a lot of the other books that fall into this sort of category of kids literature.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as a parent, I think there are a lot of reasons to let your kid read books like this, and just at a high level, for me, I really believe that kids' books are they are both windows for kids to learn about experiences that are different than theirs, and they're also mirrors for kids to go deeper into themselves and learn about who they are. And so I think it's just so important for kids to read all kinds of stuff that shows experiences and types of people and living circumstances that show the whole wide range of life that kids are living in the world.
And I think as well, we have right now, I've mentioned to you that our 12 and 13-year-old, just preteen and just barely teen grandsons are visiting us right now. And one of the things is we have conversations with them about how things, are going in school and just in life. And I think we sometimes, two things come to mind, and I'd love to get your perspective on this. As you say, yeah, your kids aren't this age yet, but you've dealt with this. You taught in middle schools. You're writing toward a certain age range, and a couple of things. A lot of the conversations that we have with them, their responses center on friendship, or sometimes the loss of a friendship. They deal with their own angst about certain things that they deal with in the setting of of school and trying to meet expectations. Bullying is a big thing that comes up, and I think sometimes we both underestimate the level of understanding that adolescents, preteens, teenagers coming into that. I mean, by the time they get to be 16, 17, 18, and they're getting taller than we are, we start to consider them a little bit more on an adult level in terms of those conversations. But I sometimes think we underestimate the level at which those older kids who are coming into those teenage years really have an understanding of worldly things. And we also tend to underestimate the level of their emotional response and reaction to the things they're dealing with all the hormonal changes they're going through and the emotional issues that they face. We'll sometimes go, well, that's not that big a deal. So somebody said something mean to you, but it's very meaningful. That's part of their development, and it's very meaningful to them when they are dealing with these things. And it's as big a deal for them to be able to work through as it is for some of the quote major issues that we as adults face. And so I want your perspective on that, but I'm also curious, as part of this thought process, do you suggest or recommend that parents also read those books so that they have a place of conversation with their kids about the things that they're reading?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic idea for parents to read what their kids are reading. I mean, I know it's not always possible, especially as the books get longer, as the kids get older. But I really do think it opens up all kinds of possibilities for conversation, because you can start by talking about the book. And then, like you said, maybe that leads to a conversation about something that's going on in school or with their own friends. And obviously, I think it, especially for parents of kids who are on a little bit of the younger side of the YA market, so the 12-year-olds to 13-year-olds, obviously there's a range of what kids are ready for at that age. And so as a parent, you know better than the booksellers what your kid is going to be ready for. So I think reading this stuff is always a good idea. But yeah, I absolutely think we do, I think, tend to underestimate what kids are feeling and thinking and dealing with at that age. And so I do think books can be a really great sort of entry point for some of those bigger discussions.
Mm-hmm. Novels, young adult novels, are not the only things that you've written in recent years. You mentioned on your website and talking kind of a little bit about your background, that you've also written some essays. And I'm curious about, when you talk about essay, and you mentioned a few minutes ago that you've written plays. And so I'm just curious a little bit about some of the other things that you've written, what the purpose and audience for those might have been, and anything else about those that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, I think I went through a lot of years of sort of exploring different types of writing to figure out what really made me where I felt like most at home as a writer. And so, like I said, I did start off writing plays because theater was what I had grown up in. Um, and so it seemed like a natural bridge between my interest in writing and my, what I was doing all day long in school and in college and doing plays all the time. So I've written a number of shows. I had my senior thesis as an undergrad was an American studies sort of ethnographic exploration of a women's shelter in New York, where I spent a summer working. And then on the side, as a companion piece to that, I wrote a one-woman play where and this is a sort of style of theater, documentary theater, that uses interviews and takes sort of verbatim clips from interviews and uses them as the content for a theatrical piece. So this show featured, maybe, I can't remember now, 6 or 7 women who I had come to know at this shelter and had interviewed extensively. And so in the play, I played all of them, and I used the text came really primarily from those interview clips. So I did that show. I did that show as an undergrad, and then when I lived in New York, I performed it in like a bunch of sort of solo show festivals and other theater festivals around town. So that was really exciting, um, and something I worked on for several years. And then I also wrote a show that was produced off Broadway called Blue Before Morning. It was produced at the DR2 Theater, which is a very cool theater space in Union Square by a small theater company called Terra Nova Collective. And I worked with them on a bunch of shows, and they were behind the production of Blue Before Morning. And so that was really exciting. That was the first time that I had seen a play of mine staged by, real actors and like with a real show. So that was very cool. But then after that, I sort of gravitated toward writing fiction, and I shifted away from writing for theater. And, that was just sort of the natural evolution of things. And ditto with essays. I've had essays published in a few places, mostly personal essays, the New York Times, Huffington Post, places like that, Slate magazine, places like that publish that type of thing. But again, I moved a little bit away from that type of writing over the years, not for any particular reason other than that my interests changed and my voice changed, I guess, over time.
It is, please don't take this the wrong way, but I just love the way you kind of said, a few places, New York Times, Huffington Post, Slate magazine. There was a little bit of a shrug, like, no big deal. But no, I get where you're going with that. All right, a couple of things that I have to get you to talk about a little bit that are not directly related, or maybe they are directly related in some ways to your writing, but you talked about the influence of theater. And I have a background, not extensive, but community theater, doing theater when I was in school, a little bit of community theater later. And so I'm always interested in people who have that acting bug and have that background, and just curious about some of the theatrical plays that you were in that were your favorites, whether it was in school or later on when you were in New York doing that type of thing. What have you been in that you really enjoyed playing a role in? And what are some of your favorite plays, musicals, comedies, dramas, whatever, to see on stage?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, so I took my niece and nephew to see Hamilton for Christmas this year. The Hamilton tour was in
Absolutely.
Boston, and I hadn't seen it. I mean, I'm like
Yeah.
behind the rest of the world on this, but I thought it was just so fantastic. I mean, again, I know I'm like way late to the party on this, but I didn't really think I was going to like it that much. Like I thought,
Yeah.
okay, it's fine, it'll be fine. But wow, like what an incredible
Right.
show. I totally loved it. And so that was, I actually think that was the first show that I had been back to since pre-COVID. Was my
Yeah.
first, like, because I don't see a ton of theater. I mean, there is theater here in Boston, but I'm not as clued into it as I was when I lived in New York. Another show I saw, and I saw this show right before the pandemic hit. So like late, actually, I think it was Valentine's Day 2020. My husband and I went to see the Boston preview showing of Plaza Suite, which was the Neil Simon play that
Yes.
that Sarah Jessica Parker and Matthew Broderick did. And so they came to Boston to do a short run before they were supposed to open on Broadway, which of course they didn't then for over a year. But so that was wonderful. And just so fun to see the two of them like playing on stage together. It was just like really wonderful to see. As far as, I mean, gosh, back when I lived in New York, we used to be much more sort of active in just going to see whatever was going on. But I guess I haven't seen a ton of other theater recently. When I was in my acting days, probably my favorite show I was ever in was in college, was a production of Mud by Maria Irene Fornes, which is she's a Cuban playwright who I was just like completely obsessed with. A wonderful experimental playwright, very influential in her sort of scene. And And so that show was just like a dream show for me to do. I had loved that play for years and really
Yeah.
wanted to do it, and finally did it as a senior in college. Um, a funny story about that is I actually took a playwriting workshop with Maria Irene Fornes when I was living in New York, and I was like so intimidated by her that I don't think I spoke for the entire 3 days of the workshop. And then at the very end, I got up the courage to ask her about the ending of Mud, which I won't spoil for anyone who hasn't. This is not a very well-known play, but for anyone who doesn't know, the end is quite devastating. And I asked her about it, and she gave me this explanation that she said she hadn't intended to end the play that way, but sometimes your characters just do things and you just have to
Mhm.
let them. And I was like, oh, that's, yeah, that's true. And
That's
then
a
I
great
followed
statement.
her out, and we shared an umbrella down the street because it was raining, and it was just like a very
Wow.
wonderful moment for me as a young writer.
Did that statement from her about the characters sort of taking on their own life and leading the writer, has that influenced your writing in your novels as well?
Totally. It's a thing I come back to. It's like I try to outline my books because it
Mhm.
just makes them easier to write. It's just I don't outline heavily, but I try to at least know what's going to happen roughly in the beginning, middle, and end. Um, but there is absolutely this element of like you don't always know what's going to happen, and as you develop the voice and the backstories and the you sort of follow the characters through the evolution of the story. Sometimes things happen that you you didn't predict or you didn't know were going to happen, and I think there's a lot of truth in kind of letting that process happen and seeing where it leads you as a writer.
Mm. I said there were a couple of things beyond writing that I wanted to bring up. The other one that you mention in your bio in a few places, trains.
Yeah, I
You and the reason part of the reason I bring that up, my dad worked for the railroad for his entire career,
do.
34 years, and I don't know if it's genetic that somehow that filters down, but I seem to have grandkids, at least one or two grandkids who are totally obsessed with trains.
Mhm.
And so anytime I encounter someone who has that kind of an interest or obsession, however it might play out, I love to get their perspective. Talk a little bit about your interest in trains, where that comes from, and how that plays out in your life.
I love this question. Anyone who knows me well will tell you you shouldn't ask her that because she just loves to talk about trains. I definitely think it's genetic. So my mom loves trains, and she's always loved trains, and she'll tell you that the origin of her obsession with trains started when she was little, and her older brother was given a toy train set, and she was not allowed to have a toy train set because she was a girl, and so this sparked uh, a lifelong passion for trains. And so she took me on my uncle lives in Los Angeles, and she took me on the Southwest Chief from originating in Los Angeles and coming back to Boston. So we went Los Angeles to
Goodness.
Chicago, and then from Chicago to Boston via Amtrak when I was about 7. Um, and it was, I mean, it's just an incredible way to see the country. And so as an adult, I really wanted to do that again. So
Mm.
I think my first adult like solo cross country train journey was in 2011 or 2012. I took
Okay.
I flew to Chicago, and then I took the California Zephyr from
Mm.
Chicago to San Francisco, which is just like the most incredible way to see the middle of this country. Like as an East Coast person, you're like, I'm like very biased toward the East Coast. And then sometimes I'll like fly over to the West Coast and maybe stop in Chicago. But like you know, to see the rest of the country unfold from a train is just so incredible.
Mhm.
Um, and the other thing I love about riding trains is the people you meet, because
Right.
who takes a train across the country? Like you have to have a reason for it. Nobody sort of accidentally finds themselves riding Amtrak for 52 hours. Um, so I just love that aspect of it. Even as an introvert and a person who doesn't especially like make small talk with strangers that easily. I just loved sitting at the tables in the dining hall and just meeting the people across from me and talking about, why are you riding this train? And so there is a cross country train ride in my first book, Rules for 50/50 Chances. And I think it's in the book just because after I took that ride, I was so desperate to put it in a piece of fiction.
Wow.
It was like, you can't make this up. It's just it's so wonderful. So anyway, so yes, I've taken a bunch of long distance trains across the country. I've gone up and down the West Coast, up and down the East Coast, of course. And my husband and I forced him to we went to India in 2015, and I forced him to take a lot of trains. The train system in India is quite extensive.
Wow. Yeah.
So
yeah. When you do these cross country trips, do you that are going to be 2.5, 3 days, sometimes even a little bit longer, do you travel coach or do you get the sleeper?
You get the sleeper.
Absolutely.
I have an Amtrak points credit card. So this is how I manage this. So, I'm racking up those Amtrak points every time I use my credit card, and then you can upgrade yourself to the sleeper, and that's really really good.
All right, couple of other things before we go today. As a writer, what advice would you give to someone who's thinking about trying their hand at writing potentially their first novel, or getting into doing writing on a more consistent, and maybe they really want to see if they can make a go of it? What is some of the advice you'd give somebody who's just starting out or just really trying to get their writing out there?
Yeah. Well, so I think the first people often come to me and ask for advice on getting a book published. And I always say, like, the first piece of it is to write the book that you want to write, because there's no way to break into publishing without writing your book first, right? There's no way to skip that step. In terms of getting your book written, there's the sort of common advice, like, to write every day. And I really am not, like, you don't have to write every day, but I do think that you have to find the rhythm that works for you. And that might be different depending on the particular circumstances that you have at the moment. So, like, my first book, I was very much I set myself a goal of writing 500 words a day, 5 days a week. And that worked for me at the time. I didn't have any kids. I had, I was working a regular 9-to-5 job, but I did have control over my schedule outside of work. So that worked for me. And, if you chip away at 500 words a day, eventually you have a whole book. But that wouldn't work for me now, because I just don't have, not every day is a writing day for me anymore. So now I have a different schedule, and I write on Mondays and Fridays typically. And that's what works for me. But I do think you have to find that rhythm that gets you into the habit of it. And then the other thing that is a piece of advice that my favorite writing professor from college always said was to write the things you're obsessed with. When I think about the books that I have started writing and ended up putting aside and never finishing, it's because I got kind of like bored in the middle. I think when you feel so obsessed with a topic that you keep thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it, like, that's the one to stick with, because to get from the beginning to the end of a novel, you have to be interested enough in the topic to want to sustain that much time spent with it, so figuring out what story you're obsessed to tell and you can't not tell, I think is the big piece.
And finally, where can people find and get your books?
What a great question, Steve. So you can find my books. You can find my books online anywhere that you like to buy books. So I am judgment free on where people like to buy books. I buy books all over the place. Independent bookstores, of course, are wonderful places to buy books. So your local independent bookstore might well have my most recent book on the shelves. My older 2 books they could order in for you. But you can also buy them on bookshop.org. You can buy them on Amazon. You can buy them on barnesandnoble.com. really wherever you like to buy books, they are available. And my website, which is kate-mcgovern.com, also has links to all of those.
And we're going to make sure that in our comment section here, and you'll also find it on my pages after the show, that we will have linked to Kate's website, and again, share the titles of her books so that you can specifically look for those where you want to find them. And I just strongly encourage you to look those up as parents, if you've got kids in those age ranges. And maybe even, you know, I know as an adult, there's a lot of those young adult books that I have found still quite fun and intriguing to read. So it's worth a look-see. Kate McGovern, author, actor, train enthusiast, all around interesting person. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on Coffee Breaks with Steve, and we'll look forward to continuing to follow what you're doing and what you're writing as your additional novels come out over time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Steve.
All right, Kate McGovern. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I enjoyed having the opportunity to spend some time getting to know Kate better and learning about her interests, books, theater, acting, trains. It's all good. It's time to go. I want to thank you once again for being here and for being part of the conversation. I want to thank you for all that you do to make Saturday mornings, or if, depending on where you are in the country, maybe Saturday midday, afternoon, a part of your regular schedule, and for making it fun for all of us. So thank you for being here. And just a reminder to please find a way to make a difference in your world this week. God bless you. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.